Westminster Law Review. We are still waiting for one more panellist, Youssef Taha, but unfortunately he's been delayed in traffic. So we'll have to make a start without him, and then he can just join in when he manages to get here. So, as you all know, you're here for the Question Time event. Tonight is the first that the Westminster Law Review has organised. We would like to get a kind of a debate going between not only the panellists, but also between the audience members and the panellists as well. If there's something in particular that you'd like to comment on, or any question that you would like to ask, then our Executive Director, Shamima Chowdhury, Shamima, could you just put your hand up, is going to be roving around with a microphone. So please do feel free to make any comments. As you can see on the screen above, behind me, we are also live tweeting this, so if you have any comments, I have Twitter open in front of me, so I can always just see what you say, so please don't say anything bad. Right, so without further ado, just a short introduction. The bios of all of our panellists are with you in the handouts, I believe, but a short introduction from my right to my left. This is Mr. Sean Hamil. He is joining us from Birkbeck College, where he's a lecturer in business. He heads up the sports business centre there. To his left is Leon Ward. He is a youth trustee for Plan UK. I've already introduced myself, the editor-in-chief of the Westminster Law Review. To my left is Mr. James Welch, who is the legal director for Liberty, an NGO that campaigns for human rights. I'm sure many of you know it. And to his left is Dr. Radha from here at the University of Westminster, who is a reader in law with the Faculty of Law here. Without further ado, we'll just kind of launch into some of the questions that we've received or that we've come up with. I think perhaps most appropriately we'll begin with one that deals with universities, since we're all sitting here in the fabulous old cinema at the University of Westminster. A question, perhaps, Radha, you can begin begin with this question. Are universities a business first and an academic institution second, in your opinion?
Okay. That's an important question because it's on our minds. I think it depends what we mean by business. Because if by business we mean is it set up to make profits, then clearly universities are not profit-making institutions. We are still a trust and we are a charitable trust. That's the legal status of universities. However, having said that, I think universities have undergone very profound changes in the place that they occupy within society. And I think the main change, at least speaking from an insider, as somebody who's an academic, is the place and the role of students and teachers in society has changed phenomenally. As far as teachers go, that is people like me, academics, here, in the old system, before the globalization, before the so-called knowledge economy came into place, we occupied a position in between different forces in society. We were between labor and capital. We were the critics and conscience of society. Between state and civil society, we occupied a position that was in the middle, as a cusp of all these different things. And so it appeared like we spoke as an independent voice in society, and we were interpreters, we were mediators between different conflicting forces in society. Now, all that has changed, and it has changed because the role of an academic in society today has become like any other laborer, any other worker. We are no longer playing that role. We are service providers. We provide a service to people who come to receive education. And I think similarly the role of students has also changed, in my view. Previously, students finished, when they grew up, they came to learn either a trade, an occupation or something, and then those who wanted to go for a job got skills in institutions we call polytechs, and the polytechs trained them in skills which brought them a job. And there were very few people, or some people, who felt that they wanted to do something beyond just going for a job. They wanted something beyond that. And so they came to universities and they learned theory, philosophy, and basically they became thinkers who thought about what kind of society, what kind of world, etc., etc. The big questions. Now that distinction has collapsed. So universities and polytechs now, they're pretty much doing the same thing. They provide a service so that you can go out and work, and many students think they come to university because they want to go out and get a job. And that's why increasingly, if we tell them, think about theory, think about society, they say, we don't want to know that. How is that getting us a job? So in that sense, the role of education in society has become one of providing services for business, for providing services for economy. And that's a big change.
Sean, do you have anything to say about this? You obviously have experience from Birkbeck.
Well, I think the first answer is it's an academic institution first, and it's a business second. Otherwise, what would be the point? But obviously, it has to be run in a business-like way. I mean, I'm in a management department, but I think good management is generic. I mean, I'm not as young as I used to be. And it was around in the 80s, and a lot of my contemporaries went into financial services and went into the city. And for a long, long, long time I was told the best brains are in the private sector, market discipline, etc., etc. That we must run the public service right the way we run the private sector. What has been delivered in the last 15 years is an economic and social catastrophe based on a particular ideology which argues that everything should be reduced to an ideology, a particular form of market ideology. Now, I believe in markets. I do think they provide discipline, but I just don't buy this idea. And I think that the so-called financial crisis that we have confirms it, that you can reduce everything to this idea of somehow business discipline, market discipline solves our problems. It doesn't. And one of the reasons why it's so important to keep our eyes on that particular idea in the university sector is to go back to why universities developed in the first place. Yes, I agree that obviously they're there to provide high quality vocational education, but they're also there primarily to educate people, not just in skills, but in a way of thinking, a critical way of thinking. I mean, when Birkbeck was originally founded back in 1823, it was for working men and tradesmen who wanted to be educated in the social sciences. They were working with their hands during the day, and they wanted to be educated at night about the wider society. Universities need to be independent, not necessarily independently funded. We can argue about the fees, etc. But I mean, it's not for nothing that the elite of the Chinese Communist Party are sending their children to places like Harvard to be educated. I think you can really tell a lot about people's true belief systems in what they want for their children. And the fact that a lot of the leading people in the Chinese Communist Party, for example, are sending their kids to Harvard, I think it tells you something. It tells you that they don't really believe in the depths of their heart in the independence of a lot of the university education provided in their own country. So to sum it up, I think that universities occupy a special position. They have an obligation to society to train people in vocational education, but they also have an obligation to educate a way of thinking, a critical way of thinking about the world. And they need to be centres of proper, evidence-based debate. They absolutely have an obligation to be run in a business-like way, to try to operate within the budgetary envelope that they're provided with. But good management, business-like management, is generic. Right? It is not something to do with market forces. And what concerns me very much is the way that a lot of this debate is being framed at the moment about the universities, is this idea that you should reduce a university to just another business operation, I think is very, very, very dangerous, because it will reduce further the space in society where we can have critical discussions about the way the market operates. And I'll repeat that because I think it's very, very important. You know, I have an economics and politics degree. Markets can be very effective, but you know, there are huge numbers of examples of market failure. We need spaces in society where we can talk critically about the way that markets operate, and universities are absolutely fundamental to that. And if we reduce universities to simply being providers of training and education on its own, we're heading in a dangerous direction.
But have the government cuts, in your opinion, have they forced universities to focus more on being self-sufficient? Are universities now feeling the strain? Do they necessarily, for example, tenure or advancement of professors and lecturers is linked to their fundraising capabilities? It's not just about how good a professor or a lecturer you are anymore, it's more about how much you can rake in for the department.
Well, I don't know what it's like in other universities. I can tell you in Birkbeck that that's not how it operates. I mean, it's the university itself has objectives. We all have objectives, you know, to be research active, to deliver high quality teaching, and if you successfully bring in research revenue, then that obviously helps you. But you know, you're not dependent on keeping your job and meeting crude business targets. But on the other hand, we all operate within an envelope where we know we have to recruit students, we need to retain them, we need to be research active. I don't have any problem with targets myself. I think that if the targets are rational, if the employer, in this case the university, educates people on what the need for them is, fine. I think that universities should be engaging with interest in industry, but as equal partners. I think that what we're talking about there is a subset of the problem. It's about, you know, how well managed the response is. But it's not an either or. You know, it's not you either be a university or you be a business. There is a middle ground to this. And just on the line, sort of that concept of the cuts. You know, I've been working in universities for 25 years, and you know, I have to say that, and I was very active in my own union for quite some time. I mean, there are inefficiencies within the university sector in Britain. We need to be honest about that. I think we need to be we need to critically reflect on how good a service we have been providing to students. And I think there could be a lot of improvements within the university sector without, you know, even within the financial envelope that we've got at the moment. There's a wider debate to be had about the fees and whether it excludes people from less advantaged backgrounds from getting into university. Personally, I think it's absolutely fundamental that problem is addressed. Once universities become somewhere for privileged people only, then we really are on a slippery slope.
I think it's useful to strip this back to the very basics to answer the first part of the question. I think if you think about what universities are, certainly at Westminster, which has 22,000 students that come here every day to teach, I think clearly it's an academic institution first. But actually it's also got lots of dip into the private sector because of the extended services that it offers. So on a baseline level, you also have access to the gym that is externally used as well, conferencing services, commissioning in for research papers, etc., etc. So whilst it has both elements there as an institution for academia, it also, of course, has the business institution. And I think what's really important for me as a student and someone who is in a governance position within the third sector is how the money is then managed upwards. What happens to the money afterwards? Where is the student representation in the spending of that money? Where is the business sense? And universities are well known for being good examples of how to do bad governance, actually. So lots of students, and indeed staff at this university, have no idea who the Vice-Chancellor is, or the Chancellorship, or even the directors of schools. And I think there are real questions there about the governance structures in place at universities, about what happens to that business revenue. If it's delivering better services for students, then I don't have a problem with how much and the ways they go about raising that. And I think there's also a role for student unions here and how how active student unions are in that spending. I know, for instance, at Westminster, the student union has representation at the highest level of governance in the organisation, but actually how accessible is the student union to students? There are lots of students in this place that don't have a clue who the president is, for instance, let alone the other structures within a governing body of the organisation. So I think you have to strip back to that. It's an academic institution first, then it's a business institution second. But what happens to the profits? That's where we need to think about. How does that reinvestment go back in, and how do we ensure engagement of the key stakeholders?
You've just seen Youssef Taha join us up here. This is our missing panellist. He's currently a writer and producer with the BBC, so he'll be hopefully giving us a perspective from the media as well. Just to bring you up to speed, we're discussing whether universities prioritise private companies, for example, whether they're a business first and an academic institution second, if you'd care to join in the debate. James, do you have any?
Not a great deal. Sadly, it's a rather long time since I graced University Hall as a student. I don't think I disagree with anything that's been said by my colleagues on the panel here. Clearly, a university should be an academic institution first and foremost. And what slightly worries me, looking at universities from the outside and talking to friends who do still work in the university sector, is that sometimes the pursuit of knowledge itself, which I think has inherent value, is somehow being displaced by increasing marketisation of the university sector, but it's not really something I'm terribly well qualified to speak on. One thing I would like to throw in, and just perhaps express some of Liberty's concerns about the way universities are run, and that is the extent to which universities are being co-opted by government to monitor their students. I'm thinking both about universities being required to monitor the political or sometimes religious activities of their students, and also universities effectively acting as sort of immigration controllers. I think that is something which we find deeply offensive. There may be justification for immigration controls, but that should be a task of government. It shouldn't be, universities shouldn't be co-opted into doing the government's dirty work.
Apologies for the delay first, terrible traffic. But talking about education, and as a former lecturer at SOAS actually, a few years ago, the issue will always remain more or less what I learned. You need, or rather want, to have free education, higher education, postgraduate education, but then where does the money come from? And the same goes for my current employer, for example, the BBC, which has license fee. Nobody wants to pay more in the current climate, obviously. So what happens? Just job cuts, right, left and centre. We lost about 3,000 people in the last 3 years alone. So going back to education itself, the money has to come from somewhere, and with the current coalition government in the UK, that launched a massive wave of cuts across the board, education was not going to be exempt from that. My view, personally, that education should be free for all, but that's a personal view, as I just said. However, universities do need the funds to come from somewhere, and what happened now here, increasing the fees to £9,000 a year on average, this has put off a lot of potential students, quite a few I know personally, and also many overseas students from coming to this country, especially when you look at the exchange rate. People in the Middle East, for example, let's say, take the example of Egypt, to come here and pay £9,000 a year, that's 100,000 Egyptian pounds. And I do have a friend whose brother rang me to ask about coming to study here, to do this chartered accountant degree, which would help him with his banking job. So I explained to him how much it would cost him to come here for 1 year. And he said, if I have that kind of money, I would not need to work or study. And so it will always remain a dilemma, do you provide free education? Does the money come from the government? The government has no money, for example. So where does the money come from? So at the moment, the outcome is that the students pay for it. But do students want to graduate with a hefty amount of debt, even if it's interest-free and easy repayments, etc.? Do you want to graduate and repay over the next 15, 20 years? It's obviously difficult issue for the government, for universities, because they have to recruit, they have to raise funds, and also for the students, where do you come up with all this money? So, I have another friend who was very happy that his son decided not to go to university because of the cost.
I know we have a lot of students in the audience, and certainly some, well, at least one lecturer I know. Does anyone have any comments about this or any questions?
I guess two hats here. So as the trustee and as a Westminster student, I think there are 2 points that I'd like to make. One refers back to James's, which is about universities acting as immigration controllers for the government. I think we have to think about this here, that if you're a business, which a university is a business at the end of the day because of the amounts of money that don't end up coming through it and the transactions that happen, if you can charge international students more money, then of course you're going to. So we have to strip this back. I think if students in the UK want better advantage, which is cheaper tuition fees, then someone has to borne the cost there, and that's international students because of the way the setup works. And I think that there are some wider issues here about how the government has almost transformed universities, and I'm not talking about the current government, previous governments, the way that the sector's changed, into being more business-like. You have to think about the people the university employs. They're ordinary professionals trying to get through their ordinary lives with the bills that everyone else has to pay. And of course you have to link their salaries then to the costs that the university raises. And of course salaries will almost definitely make up the bulk of the costs that a university has to spend. And I think the tuition fee debate is wider than that. I think there's been a lot of miscommunication over the £9,000 new fees. Apparently, and I've looked at the statistics, so the payback structure is fairer than the previous structure. But I do think that if you come from a particularly poor background, then the fear and the apprehension of £9,000 a year fees is obviously going to put you off, especially if you've come from a background where your awareness of economics and even household economics and actually managing your own finances isn't as astute as others. And my personal opinion is that I think tuition fees need to go down. I don't think £9,000 is the correct fee. I don't think the degree, certainly my experience here, and I don't think there are any law lecturers here, but I don't think the degree is worth that. Certainly my experience of it is the contact time that you've had, the quality of lectures and the quality of support outside of lectures and tutorials, I don't think is even worth the £3,500 that we've forked out for the past 3 years. So I think there are some questions about that as well, actually, that universities need to reflect internally about what they're offering. What is the market rate? What is the expectation for students, not just at studying, but also in accommodation and all the extracurricular things that university take part in? And I think one last point as well is, I think universities really need to make sure that some of the profits that they make from their other business ventures go back into supporting students. And there are huge variances out there across different universities. Westminster's bursary for students on full student finance is £400. London Met Goldsmith is £1,000, which makes a huge difference. That's more than double, which would certainly change people's perspective. And I think as unis become more competitive, we need to think about that. And the final point, I think, is the £9,000 was supposed to be, if you remember, for exceptionally good universities. It was supposed to be the exception. The office, I don't know what it is, I think it was for fair access, were supposed to regulate that and stop universities that shouldn't be charging those rates. And actually £9,000 has become the standard across most institutions. And I think that's a big concern. This has been mismanaged by the government and of course mismanaged by the universities because they see this as an opportunity to make more money.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I just want to say, just chip in a little bit on this, the way we look at the question of are universities a business or not a business? And it's, to my mind, not simply about how much fee am I paying, what return am I getting, is the university making a profit? That's not the issue. There's a bigger issue here, and that issue is the ways in which intellectual freedoms, and that's very much a civil liberties issue here, are being eroded because of this nexus with business and trade. And that money comes in so many ways. Now, I don't have a problem with where we get the money from, whether we get it the government, whether we get it from private industry, but do we have the autonomous intellectual space to say what we want to say? And that's the critical issue. In the past, there have been, for example, the United States is very well known for this. Many of their universities are founded by big business houses, Ford, Rockefeller, etc., etc. But once they have given the money, they don't interfere with what academics say. What we are finding now is in the way the funding programs are set up, the calls for research funding is set up, in the way in which we are asked to write impact statements, in the way in which business collaboration with academics happens, there is slowly an erosion of independent space. And every society needs an independent space where their thinkers can think and say what they want to without being guided by whoever is funding them. And it doesn't matter whether the funding comes from government or from private industry. The point is, do they, after giving the money, do they just leave us alone to teach, to research, to do our business as social people? We are first and foremost critics and conscience of society. That's what we are. And I think that is an important thing. If that role is eroded, then we are becoming voices for governments, voices for business, and I don't think that's our job as academics. We are critics and conscience of society. We have a role to play that is independent of that. So whoever gives the money, I'm more concerned about that space, and which I think is, I do have concerns that that space is being eroded.
We have a question here at the front. Can you get a microphone?
I was wondering how effective the panelists thought that price controls on university fees were in bringing down costs for universities, and whether it wouldn't make more sense to just boost supply to meet demand.
By boosting supply, do you mean that the government should fund more places?
More private, or no, not necessarily more places or universities.
Well, I think my own view is that, just as a private view, is that the fees are going to go higher. The government have made a decision that the taxpayers of this country are not prepared to pay for higher education. So basically what the $49 grand after the next election, the government is strong enough, they'll remove the cap. And they'll come up with some arrangements for people from different backgrounds, and that's what will happen. And what will happen in that situation is it'll deal with Leon's problem. It's that people will go there, they want to go there. But the problem at the moment is, I personally don't believe in the current model. The hefty model is like the last bastion of Soviet planet in a market economy. Why should the government allocate spaces anyway? That whole approach has failed in every other sector of the economy. I think your question is an interesting one, but it will be answered because I think that the decision has already been made. And what will happen is that those institutions who are able to meet the aspirations of students and employers will survive and expand, as is already happening. You will get niche operators coming in at the margin, say like Sotheby's or art, history, whatever. And then what you will get is the other institutions will merge. And it's already beginning to happen. And you'll end up with an American system. That's my own opinion.
Just going back to the point that Leon raised, this issue of market rate, I'd be intrigued to kind of press you a little more about that. How would you measure that?
Good question. I don't know. I think this is about students making conscious choices about where they want to study. And I think universities being able... My problem is with the £9,000 was supposed to be the top limit, and it's become the standard now for most institutions. So there isn't because of the way that this has been managed by the government agency charged to manage it, there hasn't been enough competition between universities to start charging less, because £9,000 they accept it, so why would you be the odd one out that charges less? I think this is about students making conscious choices about the contact time that you receive, the quality of support that you receive, your impressions on open days, your impressions on one-to-one meetings with whoever you see when you take to these places. And I think, certainly, I chose Westminster mainly because of the location, so that was something that swung my vote. And I think everyone's intentions will be changed by different ways. But it's difficult to say what a degree is worth, right? Because I guess you could look at what's the postgraduate opportunities. Most postgrads don't actually go into their undergrad subjects anyway, so how would you set it that way? It's difficult to set a market value on. You're asking me what is the price of education, which I think is difficult. But I don't think, from my experience, that £3,500 is what I would be comfortable. If I had the choice, I wouldn't pay that again for the contact that I've had at Westminster particularly. But I think, to answer the point at the front, I think this is part of a wider social issue, actually, is the way that over previous years, young people particularly have been pushed towards higher education as the only option. Vocational subjects have been seen as second class in this country for too long, and we've been pushing, especially in old northern towns, which are dying out. Where I come from, which is Grimsby, which is a fishing village fishing town for those that don't know, would really struggle to produce the talent for higher education, because lots of people don't want to do a degree, and I think we have to accept that. And at the moment we don't accept that. We keep pushing people towards universities, and we have to accept that that's not for everyone. So I think we've got an issue here that universities are currently overcrowded because of the way that we've been forced to go into universities in the past. So it would be interesting to see over the next couple of years whether the fees will have a levy on that or not, and actually to see whether the market at play. Of course, it's more safe to get a degree because the industry in this country isn't a huge part of the economy anymore. It's the old production work that we have in old northern towns, Wakefield, Hull, those kind of areas, Scunthorpe, we don't do it because we buy everything from abroad. So I think we have to. It's a much wider catalyst of issues. It's not just one or two things.
Just maybe to defend the undergraduate degree. I mean, at Birkbeck, our core business is people studying for degrees in the evening. Why is that? Well, first of all, a classic Birkbeck applicant would be somebody who, for a variety of reasons, got short-changed at secondary level, wasn't given the opportunity to go to university, goes into work when they're an able, capable person. 10 years later, they're doing a job and they're being bypassed by young graduates. Now, part of that is employer prejudice, but part of it is because employers recognise the world over that a university education has value. It gives you vocational training, but it also develops a way of thinking, a critical way of thinking. We must never lose sight of that. The university education adds value of itself. The 3 years studying, learning how to think independently, learning how to construct a written argument supported by evidence, scholarship, these things are important. Whether or not they've been delivered as effectively as they should is a wider debate. But I think it's a separate argument from the deindustrialisation of Britain. You know, education, you know, every single totalitarian regime that has ever been attacks education and tries to control and restrict it. So, I mean, I think we're in a period of transition in British education at the moment, and we need more critical discussion. I think some of the discussion around the fees has been hysterical, to be honest. You know, I say to some of my colleagues, look, I'm not happy with high fees either, but, you know, are we going to have a sensible debate about the shortcomings of the current system, to which there's often a bit of a silence. You know, the other thing I would say is that I'm in favour of research-led institutions because I think that develops a culture of scholarship. But one of the problems with the research assessment exercise now, the research evaluation framework, is what it legitimised a mentality where you actually got bought out of your teaching to do research only. And to me that was a contradiction of the university ideal. The whole point was that you were going to be taught by, you know, lecturers who were actually researching. And some of the best universities in the country in terms of reputation were guilty of this. And so what was happening, particularly overseas students, were paying a fortune to come to study at these universities and finding out that they were being lectured to by the PhD students of the people that they expected to see in front of them. So there's a lot of complex issues, but the bottom line is university education has value.
Okay, I think we should move on to the next question. Perhaps, Sean, you can start off with this one. Is the EU brave to cap bankers' bonuses to 1 year's salary, or does it undermine competitiveness of the financial services?
Well, I don't agree with the cap, but not for the obvious reasons that I think bankers are under-rewarded. You know, I mean, I think that, I mean, just it's a sort of comic anecdote, but in the 70s there was a major company in Britain that there was an incomes policy then. You wanted to increase prices or wages to a certain level in order to fight inflation. So what they used to do, they used to give people turkeys at Christmas, and the legend has it that they had it after the Christmas party, so people were taking depending on how successful you are, you got a bigger turkey, and they were all fighting over the size of the turkeys. Anyway, the point is that it's the job of the bank or the employer to decide employment policy. If it's a private company, the shareholders think that the bonuses are too high, and then they should act. So in a private bank, the issue of too many bonuses, is really that's a governance issue. The question I would be asking there is, why are the shareholders not acting against it? And that's one of the reasons in Britain why details of executive pay for the board are published, following the Greenbury reforms. If it's a public bank, then I don't think they should be getting bonuses at all. I don't see how RBS. Really, it's just ridiculous. The bank is still losing huge amounts of money, so why should they be rewarded? If it's the case that the bank executives are able to demonstrate to the main shareholder, in this case the government, that part of the bank where these people are generating revenues requires that remuneration, that's a separate argument. The problem with the bank bonus argument for me is it deflects from the fundamental issue, which is the reckless behaviour of the financial services sector and the way in which it has been protected. The financial services sector has almost, has destroyed, well not destroyed, has caused unbelievable damage to the world economy and social consequences for a generation, because we were all persuaded to buy into this nonsense that unrestricted market forces always delivers benefits. It's a total nonsense. There is not a market in the world that does not rely on the basic legal system that protects property rights and enforces contracts. And it's only 5 or 6. Warren Buffett, the most successful private investor in the world, described derivatives as weapons of financial weapons of mass destruction. What the EU should really focus on is implementing this Tobin tax on speculative financial movements, restricting, making sure that investment banks are separate from retail banks, because at the moment we have to bail out the banks when they go bust because of their relaxed investment and speculative activities in order to protect the mainstream banking system that we need for all our normal day-to-day business. So let's say, okay, if you want to speculate and you go bust, then your shareholders lose all your money. But that should be the core focus. The trouble with the bonus business, it's really fraught, which distracts us from this core issue, which we have to regulate the financial services sector more aggressively. It's too fundamental to the way the economy operates. And I find, I probably sound a bit distressed about it, but I am a bit distressed about it. This is a total distraction, this. It's an absolute distraction. And we should be talking about separating the banks in two and taxing these speculative flows in order to discourage them.
So you would advocate for increased regulation, but just not in this guise. You would advocate for more regulation in the sense of separating.
I'm a late convert to market capitalism. So market capitalism says we reward success and we penalise failure. How big a failure do we need? Do we need any more failure? I'm a guy in a suit, and a tie suit, the tie kind of guy, right? And I'm not in favour of a revolution. But we've just had a failure delivered upon us globally on a spectacular scale. Spectacular scale. How much bigger does it? In Ireland, right, where I'm from, my family, I'm from the north and family in the south. They've just done a deal where 5 banks in Ireland went bust, and the taxpayers of Ireland are going to be paying for that for the next 35 years. And they're cutting social services across the board. They're cutting education. People are feeling real pain. If you go to Greece or Spain, you can really see what's going on here. And I just find that one of my issues with my colleagues in the economics profession is, why is there not a more critical debate about this? And because I don't hear it. And, I just think the bonus thing, yes, the bonuses were symptomatic of a speculative culture. And we should focus on the fundamentals. I mean, why NatWest has not been broken, why RBS has not been broken up already into a retail bank and investment bank, I don't understand. That should be the starting point.
I think we had a question at the back. Do we not this time share? No? Oh, okay. Right, do we have any comments from any other panelists?
I think my comment on that is, as just been said, the culture of reward and penalising. So why has no bank has been penalised so far? This is my issue. It's fine that they've been rewarded when things were good, but things have not been good for the past 3 years, so why none of them is in jail? If it was the private companies, that would be the case, but it isn't with the banks, and there's always this proviso of banks too big to fail, and I think that's a little nonsense as well. Why are they too big to fail? Because they bring the entire economy down with them, yet nobody's there is penalised. Banks have been bailed out with massive amounts of public money, and yet they are still getting bonuses. So will the EU cap it? Yes, the EU voted to cap it. The UK is against it. Mr. Osborne is against it. David Cameron is against it. And I can't honestly understand their argument for it. The bank has been rewarded handsomely because they were taking risks, but some who sought bigger rewards were taking reckless risks, which we all are paying for at the moment. So I would think personally a cap should be brought in and more penalties for those who have failed as well.
I just want to chip in here and say that this whole bankers' bonus issue, to my mind at least, is a populist issue, and it's scapegoating people because, and to cover up for deeper problems in the economy. And I think if we want to go to the roots of it, we need to go beyond band-aid solutions and to really look at what is the problem with the economy today. And if you look at the whole problem is in the financial sector. And the problem is with this magic thing that we call money. Yeah. What is money? It's a piece of paper. Yeah. What makes that piece of paper more valuable than this piece of paper that I have with me? It gets its value because it is backed by something in society. In the old days, it used to be backed by gold and silver. It was solid. So it was symbolic of whatever gold and silver countries had. In post-World War society, we moved on to paper currency, which was backed by production in the society. So there was concrete wealth being produced, goods and services being produced in society, which then was reflected in that symbolic piece of paper that we call money. What is happening today is that bottom has collapsed. So what we are left with is a piece of paper, and that is the problem. That is the problem with it, and it has, of course, consequences for employment, consequences for communities, consequences for so many things. But the point is, we don't have any industries. You look at British economy, what is it standing on? Yeah, this used to be, or this is the home of what we call the Industrial Revolution. All the industries have moved out. Why? Because we nurtured all these mega corporations, and they made the money out of British taxpayers, hard-working British people, and then they took their companies and went somewhere else and set up sweatshops in Asia and wherever else. That's why we have lost industries. Yeah? Then we created a banking, financial sector. What do? We get money, we lend, and we borrow, and that money passes through a small area that we call City of London. So it's a global broker. And any brokerage company knows that you can't live on brokerage if things around you are not really working. And that's the problem. Yeah? And then we have a third sector, which is spectacles and events. Look how much we rely on events like Olympic Games, events on, everything, even a royal wedding becomes, oh, that will bring income to City of London. That's what we have relied on. We need to go back and look at something called a real economy, where real people produce real goods and services that are consumed by the communities. And if we can't go back to those basics, then we are just going to be dealing with all this band-aid solution. And I don't think that's a long-term solution. It's a populist one, and it will definitely feed into election and electoral politics. Whether it's going to change anything for us as a society, I'm not sure.
I think the original question, which is was the EU brave? I think yes is the answer. I think that we can't deny that, but I do think it has bowed down to popular opinion. Bankers have been bashed for several years now, and I don't think it's right. I would agree with the past 2 or 3 comments, which is actually let the market do its job here. The bank should be setting employment policy and should be therefore setting salary and bonus rates. I do agree with Sean that the exception should be RBS, which is majority taxpayer owned, because you shouldn't be rewarding failing banks with huge amounts of bonuses when they're failing the customers that they're there to serve and actually not making a profit for the taxpayers who own the thing anyway. And I also agree that we need to start splitting the retail and investment side so that we can protect consumers' money and that shareholders invest with the attached risks.
But given the impact of the banks and the repercussions of the banks on the financial crisis, is there not an argument for increased regulation from the EU?
I think you can increase the regulation, but I don't think capping bonuses is going to do that. That's not going to change. I don't think that's going to change people's attitudes enough. If you're going to have a regulator, it needs to have draw its power from law. The Financial Services Authority can do that. I think you can increase the power in its regulatory authorities, which is certainly an idea being bounced around. And if the EU wants to create a similar body, do that, but I'm not sure that adding another layer of bureaucracy between national and transnational law will help do that. But I would agree that increased regulation should definitely be on the statute, but I think you should empower something that already exists rather than create a new body.
My suspicion is this is probably foolhardy rather than brave, because I suspect the bankers will manage to get their way around it if they want to pay themselves large bonuses. As Sean said, I think it's slight froth, and it's not really dealing with the underlying problem, which is proper regulation of the financial sector, whether that be at national level, or I would probably think it would be more effective if done at the European level. You could also look at this as sort of a battle of who is the more unpopular here. Obviously, we're used to slagging off bankers. A lot of people also go around slagging off the EU. So in this sort of battle between bankers and the EU, it'll be interesting to see which way the tabloid press come down if they decide to criticise more.
There was a massive recession in the world in the 30s, and one of the reasons for it was because of the reckless behaviour of banks in the 20s. And that is why the Americans brought in laws in the 30s separating investment banks from retail banks and not allowing banks to become too large. Now, from the 80s onwards, with the increased supremacy of the market ideology in the US following Reagan, this was diluted until we reached a point in this century that basically the banking system was able to do exactly what they wanted, and basically they ran amok, is what they did. And we have a rerun of the 30s. Now, I'm an economist, but I'm also interested in politics and interested in political history. Everything that happened was entirely predictable. We just have to be serious about it. We just have to, and we have to prevent it happening again. What disturbs me most about this debate is that it has been recrafted as somehow or other that these poor bankers are being scapegoated, and that basically people are, it's about envy. It's the old argument about envy. This is a nonsense. We have had a catastrophe served upon us, and we have to make sure that it doesn't happen again, so that our children don't have to pay, don't have to repeat this history. And so what we need is, we do need more regulation. What happens when you have an unregulated market is not the survival of the most efficient. It's the survival of the gangster who is the most unscrupulous, and has the most gunmen. The reason why the Russian oligarchs come to Britain for their, to have their cases heard is because they believe in the independence of a judicial and legal system which has been built up over 500 years. Now, I just think that we need to apply a bit of clear thinking to the financial system and say, sorry, deregulation did not work. It has unleashed a global recession. I'm sorry, well, I'm not sorry at all, actually, but we have to aggressively regulate you in the public interest, and we have to put clear restrictions on what you are able to do in terms of speculating to make money for yourselves while socialising the risk of the consequences when you get it wrong. Because basically what we got here was socialism for capitalist speculators, and the rest of us are paying for it, and boy are we paying for it. I mean, I personally have not had a proper pay rise now for 7 years. Let's not talk about bonuses, guys. Let's not talk about bonuses.
Do you have any comments before we move on? Yeah.
While I think we can all certainly agree on that it's certainly the banks' fault, to what extent do you think it's really due to the failure of the FSA and really having a more of a reactive rather than a proactive approach to regulation? I mean, what we're seeing now is the FSA, given its failure, is getting split up in about a few weeks' time into the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. So how much do you think it's really due to the failure of the FSA rather than the banks themselves?
To what extent is it
Well, I'm not an expert on the FSA, but I mean, that's a bit like saying, well, some guy breaks into your house and, it's the police's fault. No, it's not. I mean, the FSA, my own view is that, as I've already stated, is financial services is too important not to be regulated aggressively. It is a nonsense that, there's a long history of investment banks engaging in risky behaviour. That's fine if they go bust and the shareholders pay the price. The whole point of a company about risk management is that the governance structure should be such that the shareholders, that's why we have the Financial Reporting Council guidance of corporate governance. That's why best practice requires to have a majority of independent non-executive director on the board. That's why the chair should be separate from the chief executive. Those were all brought in after the Maxwell scandal, initially in the 1990s, and then through the various other governance scandals that we've had since Polytech and all in America. And at the heart of it is this idea that the shareholders, in order to protect their interests, should be able to protect themselves against over-reckless behaviour by management. That's why, you just think about this, the Financial Reporting Council guidelines say explicitly the chairman should be a non-executive and it shouldn't be the chief executive. Basically what they're saying is you need to avoid the concentration of power in the chief executive, because the interests of the paid employees can differ from those of the shareholders in the short term. They could be chasing bonuses and it's destroying shareholder value at the same time. So, that's the principle. But the problem is that if you allow a situation to emerge whereby if a company collapses, actually it's not just the shareholders that lose their money, everybody loses their money, then I'm afraid that the system of governance is not working. And that's what happened. That's what happened. I mean, the very last takeover by NatWest, RDS, the ING one. I mean, even the Financial Times was saying, where's the due diligence on this? I mean, it was a hubristic bid, but nobody shared a fault. I think to go and say, well, it's the fault of the FSA. I mean, it was the fault of the government of the day. But I also don't. I mean, the people who were working at these banks were clever people. I just do not buy the idea that they didn't know where all this was going. But they're focused on short-term reward. And the catastrophe is. I'm just astonished that we're even still having this discussion. I mean, what more has to go wrong before we recognise that we can't allow it to happen again?
And I think just a minor point actually about regulatory bodies. They seem to be failing more often than doing anything. failing more than they are succeeding, and the horse meat scandal is a good observation of that. And actually, you can even turn this into education, so at Ofsted, with the things over recent GCSE regrade papers and things like that. The regulatory authorities, of course, are reactive because it's difficult for them to be proactive. It's hard to just randomly start an investigation without any particular response or reason to do that. So I think there is a wider debate here about regulatory authorities and the way that they work and whether actually they're worthwhile. There are lots of issues over competition with the Office of Communications, etc., etc. So we could go on, but I think the Financial Services Authority, I think I agree with Sean, it's hard for it to be reactive because, of course, for it to be proactive because, like I said, it's really difficult to just go up to an organisation and randomly start an investigation into the behaviour when there is no particular reason to do so. And I think Sean's other point actually is that bankers probably knew what was going on. They are very intelligent people that usually work there. I guess it's difficult for the FSA to just second guess that and to randomly start investigations without any due diligence or support behind them.
I'm not an expert in financial FSA and financial regulation and things like that. But I can say something about globalization and the kinds of regulatory regimes that it has instituted in place, of which FSA is very much a part. Yeah? And basically, the core idea, the central to the whole globalization, from where we have so many other regulatory authorities, is that the markets can self-regulate, that financial sector, economic sectors, trade, industry, business, they can all self-regulate. And that means effectively saying, we don't want any social oversight. And that's a fundamental problem. Society must have oversight over whatever activities. And here we have this concept of self-regulation. We will have our own codes of conduct. We will regulate ourselves. We don't want the state. We don't want any other social institutions to look over and watch over us. And that's a fundamental problem. And that is why we have lost control over the economy. There is no say. We can vote any party into power. It's not going to make any difference to the fundamental issues in society. And I think there is a deeper problem that if we don't go into, we're just going to skim the surface of this.
Okay, let's move on to another controversial issue. Oh, was there? Oh,
well, I was just going to comment on that. In terms of the laissez-faire ideology, then, do we see this as the state infringing upon that by capping bankers' bonuses and effectively punishing the bankers that were involved in all of this? Is that a form of punishment? And what type of, a few people had mentioned penalties and penalizing those that have sort of let this go out of control. So what kind of penalties do you think are even possible?
Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with penalizing bankers for whatever they have done. But let's be clear. They did what they did because there was a regime that allowed them. There was a regulatory regime that allowed them to do that. And we can even talk about regulating or fixing the regulatory regime, but we still need to go back to and see why we have, this whole dependence on finance as the mainstay of our economy instead of actual production of goods and services. That's still a fundamental issue to me. Yeah? We can do all that, and there's no problem with that. But we need to go to the bottom of the problem, and that's what I'm saying.
Right, let's move on to our next question. Now, news broke on Wednesday that according to the figures from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Syrian refugees now exceed the 1 million mark. On the same day, UK Foreign Secretary William Hague announced that Britain is to step up assistance to Syria's opposition, providing armoured vehicles, body armour and other non-lethal equipment to the, quote, moderate democratic forces, unquote, battling President Bashar al-Assad. He says that the EU has to move further if there was no political solution on the ground. Should the international community provide military assistance to the Syrian National Coalition? James, is Britain on the path to arming Syrian rebels?
I don't know, it looks like it might be. I mean, I find the whole notion of interfering in another country's internal affairs a very difficult one. I think 10 years after the Iraq invasion, we can see why that would be. But I can see that there may be situations where circumstances in a country are so bad that the international community should intervene. My concern is more for the means, the routes by which this happens, rather than the end result. I don't know at the moment myself whether we should intervene and provide arms or not. What I'm very concerned about, though, is that it should be done in accordance with international law. I think a major problem with the Iraq War was that there was no proper international legal basis for it, and we saw what a disaster that turned out to be. The rule of law is very important in this country. We might come on to discuss some points around that later. It is also, I think, equally important in an international context as well. So I would want to see any intervention by the international community or by parts of the international community having a proper legal basis in international law, everybody obeying the rule of law.
I have a different view on that, I'm afraid. With the case of Syria, you can argue for sending troops or military equipment, and you can argue against it. I'm not going to go as far back as Iraq, even though one of the reasons was used then was the weapons of mass destruction, also that Saddam was killing his own people and gassing people in Halabja, and etc. But let's go a bit nearer than that. Libya. The argument was used that Gaddafi was killing his own people. Is Assad not doing the same? So far documented in Syria, 70,000 people have been killed, and I have been working on Syria a lot. So 70,000 killed in the span of 2 years, 1 million refugees, more displaced inside Syria itself. So is that not a case for intervention? However, if we go back to Libya, Libya was a clear, open and shut case. Next door was Tunisia. They already had the revolution, so they were not going to support Gaddafi in that way. Egypt, they didn't really have any love lost with Gaddafi either, so it was more in their interest to get rid of him. And the other factor is oil. Who is going to guarantee the oil supplies to the West, which keeps the machines running, keeps the houses warm? Syria has no oil. But the difference between Syria, or another difference rather, between Syria and Libya, Syria is in a terrible neighborhood, which is not the case with Libya. Syria next door has Jordan. Half the Jordanians are Palestinians or Palestinian descent. Israel is to the west, and we know what that is like. And then we have Lebanon, which is in trouble itself. On the other side, we have Iran, which hasn't recovered from the Iraqi invasion 10 years ago. And then we have Iran supporting Assad, along with Moscow. Moscow, we know why supporting Assad. Mainly, well, they keep saying that they are not in the business of regime change. However, Russia has its only naval base in the Mediterranean and Middle East in Syria and Turkey. And that is very, very strategic to the Russians. Also, Syria is a massive market for Russian weapons. We are a big customer. So that generates a lot of money for Russia as well. Iran, we know why they're supporting Assad, because also he's also a link with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we know that is against Israel, which is part of Iran's strategy, rather. And then we have Hamas on the other side. So the neighborhood itself is quite booby-trapped and more or less a time bomb. And not forgetting that Syria itself has no oil, other resources, strategic importance to the West. No, they don't really have many friends in the West, or even in the Middle East at the moment. One main reason, they are anti-Israel. The Israel-Syria front technically is still the only front that is active since the Six-Day War and then the 1973 war. That is still an active front, even though there has been no firing or bullets going through there. But that's still an active front. All the other fronts since that Arab-Israeli war half-time peace deals or truces and ceasefires. And for the neighbourhood itself is quite really trapped. The interests are quite conflicting from the various parties, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, or the West, led by the US and the UK. So the argument will always remain. Do you provide weapons to the Syrian opposition? Again, which opposition? We know now the Nusrat Islam have gained a foothold in Syria among the Syrian opposition, and some of them have started imposing Sharia laws in some parts of Syria. And you mentioned the word Sharia in the West, and that is a regret to a bull as well. So, like John Kerry was saying last week during his tour, we don't want weapons to fall into the wrong hands. So we want to provide opposition, but a good opposition. You see, but again, good in whose eyes? We know one thing in common among all the different factions of oppositions in Syria. They all want Assad out.
But is a key difference not the intervention of the United Nations? I mean, there's a tweet that I see here from Gareth Lewis Shelton, quoting Tony Blair, saying, "Inaction is a decision to maintain the status quo. No state has the right to tyrannize, and the UN must always interfere." But obviously a key difference between Libya and Syria, you've mentioned the similarities between them, the key difference is that there was a UN Security Council resolution to take all necessary measures in order to stop the killings in Libya. There's been no similar resolution in Syria.
Yes, but there was also Russian and Chinese opposition to the resolution in Libya, but these were persuaded to change their minds. And that's how the resolution came about.
But realistically, going back to the previous point, any action has to be taken in accordance with international law, or else once you start flouting international law, then it becomes an international free-for-all, does it not?
Pretty much. It was free-for-all in Iraq.
And there was a backlash, but...
There's still a backlash.
There is a backlash. Be that as it may, the fact that a mistake was made in the past does not excuse a mistake to be made again. In the case of Syria, any intervention would be illegal without a UN Security Council resolution advocating for that.
Again, even with the resolution on Libya, which meant only targeting the military bases of Gaddafi that were being used to kill his own people. That did not exactly happen, or rather did not happen exactly this way. You see, there were foreign boots on the ground, which was not in the UN resolution. And if you watch the videos at the time, entering Azizaya, Gaddafi's compound, if you watch it very carefully, you would have seen some guys with very advanced assault rifles strapped to their sides. They were moving with great focus on target, unlike the layman Libyan who just took up a rifle and started firing in every direction. These were Qatari special forces. They were not Libyans.
But the resolution allowed for that. The resolution allowed for NATO intervention.
Yes.
So fighting just... Leon, are there any other methods of providing assistance?
Well, yes. I think for the original point, I think the case for Syria is already made. That intervention has to happen at some point, but there are all these different arguments that happen. And from an NGO perspective, there are lots of NGOs already operating in Syria who have already launched emergency appeals, etc., etc. And I'm aware that the Disasters Emergency Committee is launching an appeal either next week or the week after, in the normal fashion, whereby funds are pooled and then distributed between the different NGOs to do different things. So intervention is happening at NGO level, but it's kind of pointless when you're trying to fight against this tidal wave, which is the huge increase in refugees. And actually, NGOs can only do so much in terms of provision. So certainly Plan, the charity that I represent, is going in to offer psychoanalysis support for children and young people and their supported families. I know Water Aid are going in to do water, etc., etc. The Red Cross will be going in to do its ordinary medical intervention. So NGOs are already starting, but it's very difficult to operate in that kind of atmosphere. And I think we also have to recognise that there are security issues here for NGOs. So signing off from a governance perspective, and endorsing intervention by our staff is a huge risk, because the security risk there is enormous for us. We're essentially authorising people to risk their lives. So I think there are issues around that, and obviously military intervention, which the case I think has already been made. And I would agree that the UN is the right agency to do that rather than individual countries on their own.
So you don't think that a similar scenario to, say, for example, France's intervention in Mali should happen?
Well, I think it's difficult when countries start just operating on their own. That's what the UN was established for, and the fact that a security resolution hasn't passed yet is a bit strange. I can't quite get my head around it, considering the impact that this is having on civilians with a million refugees. I think France was I think it might have been a bit too early to intervene without the information that we have now. The fact that the British have followed is probably tantamount to that actually the time has come, and I think the time has come. But I would prefer to do it with a UN security resolution backing it to make sure that we abide by international law. But I do worry as well, actually, the impact that this is going to have on the public's view here. I don't think appetite is there from the public, appetite is never there from the public, but to dispatch more forces abroad when we're starting to return some from different interventions anyway. And I think we have to be wary of that because of the fundamentalist ideologies that are tied behind some of that. And I would be worried about that impact, and I don't think we've been forward about that yet. But yeah, so I support intervention in Syria. I just would have preferred it with the UN backing.
Radha?
I think there's a famous, well-known saying that truth is always the first casualty in any war. So in any war, I think we have a double, triple responsibility to actually verify what is the truth. I actually question, the question said international community, and I question what is the international community? What do we mean by international community? Is it the Fire Security Council members? If it's a Fire Security Council members, these are people who victorious allies in the World War. That's the Fire Security Council members. If by international community we mean the 193 states that are members of the UN, they don't have any powers there, because all they can do is make recommendations. So we live in and this is why I think it's very important not to go just one issue, very narrow focus, and then go to a second issue, because then we get dragged in from Iraq, Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya, then Syria, then Iran, then Korea, and then who knows what else, because Obama has already moved the naval fleet to the Indian Ocean already. So I think this is why it's important to get the big picture and the context very clearly before we start really looking at it. Now, if the international community means 193 states, they have not had any say in this. So that is the first point. The second one is, we are seeing a pattern here. We are seeing a pattern since the end of the Cold War, very systematically. There has been regime change in one country after another. And in each country's case, we have told a certain kind of story about that event. Don't look at the big picture, just look at what is happening and all this emotional stuff about so many refugees, etc. And it's always a great human tragedy. Let's make no mistake, any war is a great human tragedy for everyone. In a war, as the Buddha said, there are no victors and no vanquished. Everybody is a loser. So that's the first principle about war. Yeah? And in any war, that is the case. But what we are seeing now is we are talking about international law. International law says no regime change. And people who have instituted regime change and are openly talking about it, there's nothing we can do about it. People are openly talking about Assad must go, Gaddafi must go, we don't like him, Saddam must go. This is against international law. Now, if we want international law, either we want it or we don't want it. We may need to make a decision on this. If we don't want it, then it's a free-for-all. And if we want it, then what are we doing about people when they violate international law? What are we doing about states that go to war without international law sanction? What happens to them? And if there are no consequences, then what international community are we talking about? I mean, that's my fundamental problem here.
But where does self-determination fit into that? Where obviously the sovereignty of states is very important, regime change is not permitted in international law, but all peoples have the right to self-determination. Where these people cannot assist themselves, is there not a responsibility to protect specifically or particularly in cases, humanitarian cases like this?
Well, I think what we are seeing, and self-determination is an important principle, and people who come from colonial countries like me, for example, we value that. Our independence struggle is a very big inspirational moment for all of us. So that is a very important thing. But what is the self-determination against? Who are we fighting against? In the national liberation struggles, we knew who we were fighting against. There was a colonial empire, and we fought for liberation. Our grandparents, our parents, they fought for freedom of the country. Now what we are fighting against is there is a whole discourse that puts people against people. Shia, Sunni, Hindu, Muslim, this, that. And this whole identity politics is playing into self-determination in a way that instead of looking at the big global G8 financial powers, etc., we end up killing each other. And this is what is happening to self-determination. It has been hijacked by big powers, by global powers, and because of the extraordinary influence of media, of discourse, of psychology, public, and so on, we have, if you like, refined the techniques of producing a discourse where very quickly people go against people. And I'll tell you the example of the country I come from. India and Pakistan were one people for centuries, since the Indus Valley civilization. Within 6 months, we ended killing up each other, and there was a partition, with 6 million people crossing borders, ethnic cleansing on a scale that people have not talked about. Yeah? So within 6 months, everything changed. So these things can happen very quickly, and one needs to be very clear about what it is that we are talking about. Self-determination is important, but if we don't know who our friends are and who our enemies are, what self-determination are we talking about? And I think that's an important, and it's a serious issue now, because everywhere it's happening. In Iraq, there was a lot of opposition to Saddam. People there knew that he was a dictator. But this kind of, sectarian politics is new to Iraq. And I think that's something that we need to think about.
Any comments? We have one here at the front.
Hi, I just want to ask a question to the panel. Do you think if intervention did happen, then what would happen after that? Would there be, because of the sectarian issues within Syria itself, would we see something maybe similar to Afghanistan, where arming different groups will see them split into different groups, and then you'll see, the consequences of that? Thanks.
What would the aftermath be?
This is always a concern which is also putting off a lot of Western power from arming Syrian opposition. The case of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and his comrades were armed to drive out the Soviets after they invaded Afghanistan. But then the Americans didn't know what to do with him after the Soviets had left. And we know what happened after that. So going to Syria, this is one of the greatest concerns of the US mainly. There are so many different factions, it's a minority ruling the majority, and then are you going to have revenge attacks if Assad goes? The Americans keep talking about, would like to see an orderly transition with the help of Assad himself, and still to last week, actually, as recently as last week, the Americans were still offering Assad a safe passage in the form of exile in Russia. Well, he said he is going to live and die in Syria. So, what will happen after Assad goes is anybody's guess, to be honest. no matter how you look at it, because you have different factions, different ethnic groups as well, and there's old history. In 1982, the current president's father, Hamil, also had a rebellion in Hamil led by the Muslim Brotherhood there, and he sent in the tanks and the airplanes. 20,000 people were killed, and there are still to this day around 30,000 disappeared to this day from 1982, that their families don't know whether they're alive or dead or where are they, if they're still alive. So this is the old history, and I'm sure when the current president goes, there's going to be a lot of events. We've already seen some of them during the fighting between the rebels and the government forces. I've seen so many videos. It's part of my job actually to verify Syrian videos. So there are lots of atrocities being committed by both sides in the form of torture, abuse, etc., etc. Some executions, shooting and killing on spot, and even to the point of enjoying it, where a bunch of soldiers took turns shooting at one guy's head while he was still alive, and I'm going to spare you the gory details. So the old history, especially from 1982 with the massacre of Hamil, this will come back to haunt the current regime and its remnants when they go as well. So I think if Assad is toppled and the rest is left to time and fate and whoever takes over, whoever is stronger, it will be quite bloody. It will be very, very bloody.
Yeah, I just want to say, just add to one more to things that are said here. I think we need to be consistent in whatever we hold. If we say that Russia should not arm Assad, we should also ask ourselves, is it okay for the West to arm the opposition? Because what is happening here is both sides are being armed. We are very open to easily criticize one or the other, but we don't hold a consistent standard. If the principle is no foreign power should interfere in the internal affairs of the country, and this is where the self-determination comes in, it is for the people of Syria to sort out what their future and what they want without interference from outside. What is happening now is arming from outside, and we've seen that, and there's evidence to that. And that is not really helping matters. What we are also seeing is a systematic effort in all these countries. People everywhere are unhappy with their governments. This is not unusual. People are unhappy with governments. We are unhappy, many of us at least are unhappy with the way we are governed. But to exploit for external forces to exploit that unhappiness, arm dissidents, and then start intervening in that, and then create an internal civil war or internal dissensions to the extent that people can't live together. And that's the serious issue. And I think that's happening in country after country, and there's a pattern to this, and we are seeing this everywhere.
This is quite wonderful as it may sound. It's very idealistic, and I'll tell you why. The one thing that most countries have been consistent with is interest, their own interests. Not international law. Well, international law says no regime change. How many regime changes can I list to you in the past 3 years? Quite a few. So the consistency is always with where does one country, especially a superpower's interests lie. If we go to Egypt 2011 for the revolution, and during the revolution, Hillary Clinton said, Mr. Mubarak is democratic, is elected, the regime is very, very strong, so we're not worried about it. Within 18 days he was gone. And your other point about self-determination is also a very good concept, but generally is paved with thorns. And I'll give you the example of Western Sahara's self-determination, which was stipulated by the UN. 1975, the Spanish left Western Sahara, which was one of their colonies, and they left its fate undecided. They just left it to people to do whatever they will with it, or neighboring countries to do what they want. And what happened was that Morocco's late King Hassan, he led a march, which he actually named the Green March, of several thousand Moroccans into the Western Sahara. It's Moroccan. The dispute continues to this day at the UN. The UN ruled that they should have self-determination, and people will decide what they want to do. They are still haggling to this day over who is Moroccan and who is Sahara to take part in that referendum. Because Morocco, which is now the occupying power, keeps saying that all those thousands of people it sent into the Western Sahara are from Western Sahara. And therefore they are natives. While Polisario Front, which leads the opposition there, is saying no, they are not Sahara, they came from Morocco in 1975 and should not take part in the referendum. And therefore, to this day, the haggling continues, and the Western Sahara issue has become a forgotten case. So if we're going to have self-determination referendum in Syria, it can go on for God knows how many decades into the future.
I think it's easy to present as many options as possible to try and guess what's going to happen next, but it's impossible to know. But I would say what is certain, and always is in these situations, from an NGO perspective, is the things that NGOs deal with in this aftermath intervention. Trafficking children is always a huge issue in disaster-struck areas, and the Syria conflict you can word it as a disaster. Child soldiers is another key issue for Plan International and other organisations like War Child, if you've ever heard of them, and Youssef and Save the Children. Child soldiers are always a key issue at these points because they're easily exploited and easily bought and forced into this kind of labour. I think sexual exploitation of women and children is always a key issue, which automatically ties in often with the trafficking. And this isn't just trafficking within Syria, this is often cross-border trafficking. Haiti, child trafficking has been a huge issue. I think health provision, in terms of what you would automatically define as health, but actually further than that, is especially the psychoanalysis support for children and young people. And the last one, of course, is infrastructure, which a lot of NGOs do in what we call the Global South, what we would better know as developing countries. How do we then repair the infrastructure that the Syria conflict has destroyed? This is going to put huge forces on an already tight purse in the international development sector. And I think those things are almost guaranteed to happen in Syria, whatever happens politically. And I often think people forget about those things. And often the British public, who are usually very generous in disaster times, when it comes to conflict, it's often a very different story because they often find it difficult to realise what the humanitarian issues are. So just to put that on the table is something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in Syria, so I don't have a view on the specifics of the military intervention. But one thing I do have a view on is, I think, the point that James made. And it's where all you lawyers come in. I mean, I think after a catastrophe, you often get the most clarity of thought. I mean, that's why we have a UN. The United Nations came in the post-war period because we knew rightly that we didn't want to repeat this global catastrophe. And basically, there's been evolution since then. My perception of a conception of global human rights. And those global human rights need protection. And instead of talking about what we should do with Assad now, when for 35 years he's been torturing his own people, his father before him, it's a bit like, the horse is bolted now. I mean, in my own part of the world, David Cameron's just made an apology to the Finucane family about the fact that it looks like there was state collusion in the murder of a lawyer who was protected, a human rights lawyer. That happened in the UK, and I think the reason that happens is that once you allow the military imperative to take priority over the absolute sanctity of human rights, once the military guys get involved, they move with discipline and focus to eliminate people, because that's what they do. That's what they do. Sometimes you need those guys. When everything is shot to hell, when everything is collapsed, and you're in a brutal fight for survival where, for example, against the Nazis. But you don't, the whole reason why structures is to prevent that descent into barbarity. You know, if you talk to, for example, veterans of the Second World War, they never ever talk about the glory, in my experience, and I've talked to a lot of them. They all view it as a necessity, but which they never want repeated on a future generation. And I personally think the message of all this, again, is what James and his organisation work to protect, is that we have to have an understanding of what we think is civilised behaviour, that we legally protect people, and we actually impose sanctions on those who go against it. And that's why things like the sort of international war crimes, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but that seems to me to be a step in the right direction. Whether or not enough people, in the 90s at Birkbeck, one of the tragedies of working at Birkbeck is that every time there's a war, we have lots of refugees in London who are studying in the evening, and they tell you their stories. And what went on in the Balkans in the 90s is, some of the things that I was told by Christians was beyond belief. And it was it's on our back, it's in our back garden here in Europe, and it seems extraordinary to me that within living memory of the Second World War that was allowed to happen. And I think it just comes back to the central point that we have to have our what we regard as acceptable behaviour. We have to frame it in a proper legal system, and we have to impose. We actually have to implement that legal system. Now, it's not working very well at the moment, but what we mustn't do is allow everything to degenerate to some conception of realpolitik about what's right in a particular circumstances and who we think the good guys might be through the fog, because it won't work like that. What will happen is, you pick a faction, you arm them to the teeth, they will become dehumanised through the whole process themselves, and what's ended up is just a bloody mess, which the NGOs try to, put a band-aid on, and for the next 3 generations you have people just desperate for some form of justice or revenge.
Okay, I'll just make 2 very quick, and I won't take very long on this. I just want to comment, just pick up the point about the Western Sahara conflict and Morocco conflict. All over the former colonies, there are many conflicts like this. Mali and Benin, you can go Rwanda, you can go to anywhere, Congo, so many places. And this is the unfortunate legacy of colonialism, that people there are paying with, and that people, the big powers, are continuing to exploit. And I think we need to have the patience to go behind the conflict and to see really how we can resolve the historical issues without, and not just go and say, it suits our interest now, let's go and bomb this place, and let's go and bomb that place. That's not the solution if we are serious about it. And I also want to come back to this question of interests. Yes, economic actors have interests, states have interests, and they all act in their interests. We need to ask ourselves, as ordinary working people, do we have our interests or we don't? What is our interest? People who want to earn their living, raise their families, live a peaceful life. Do we have an interest in having a peaceful, fair, and stable world? Stable, I see. And we do have an interest in this. And I think we need to start speaking out about this interest. And as far as I'm concerned, I think ideals are what makes us human. That's what it is. That's what makes us rise above all this everyday interest and hope for a better world. If we don't have that, we are not human. And that's my bottom line.
Okay, we have a lot of very interesting questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get through anywhere near as many as we wanted to, but I think we should move on to the next question. Bringing things more homeward round, the Justice and Security Bill, if some of you may already be familiar with it, it's currently making its way through Parliament, and this particular bill provides for closed material procedure in relation to certain civil proceedings. Essentially, it would allow the Secretary of State the right to close proceedings where it would be contrary to public interest, i.e. national security or international relations, for the government to disclose A, the information itself, B, whether the information even exists, or see whether the government has the information. These are being labelled by some as secret courts. It has been examined by the Advocate General for Scotland, who has stated that it is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So the question then is security intelligence more important than justice? James?
I think they're both very important principles. Obviously, our security services, by and large, need to be able to keep the information that they get, how they obtain information, secret. What concerns liberty about this proposal is that this will be a major inroad into our tradition of justice in this country. The tradition of justice in this country is that both sides place their cards on the table, both sides know what the other side is saying, both sides hear the other party's case in court, and the judge then decides. What this bill will do is introduce into our legal system, to civil proceedings in this country, complete inequality. The government will be able to effectively persuade a judge to withhold evidence from claimants. It's usually going to be a claimant bringing a claim against the government, and that evidence will not be revealed to him or her, and we, the public, the broader public, will never get to hear that evidence either. You have to think about the context in which this proposal has arisen. It is in the aftermath of the so-called War on Terror. The terrible things that it's quite clear now were done in the name of protecting all of us from terrorism. Rendition, moving people to foreign countries where they're subject to torture, collusion, it was seen quite clear by British, American officials in the torture of people in countries where they don't have the scruples which we in the West have about using torture and human degrading treatment. It is in all our interests that that should come to light, but this bill is quite clearly an attempt by the government to stop that coming out. The government argues that it is prevented from defending itself in the court unless it can produce information which it couldn't put in the public domain. Well, we have for years had systems in this country where ministers could sign public interest immunity certificates which prevented certain evidence going before the courts. That stays in place. There's no reason why that can't still be used. That worked very adequately, but the government is now seeking to conceal what we think may well prove to be serious wrongdoing on the part of the security services by introducing this bill which will prevent that information being put before the civil courts. I think it is a very, very dangerous precedent to set. It runs completely counter to our traditions of justice in this country. We have been lobbying hard, MPs and peers, to reject that part of the bill completely, the bill effectively, all the bill completely. There were improvements put into the bill in the House of Lords which would require the judge considering an application to go to a closed material procedure. It would still allow for that procedure, but it would only allow a judge to do that if it was an absolute last resort, and the judge had to balance the interests of protecting national security with the public interest in serious wrongdoing come out. The government managed to overturn those amendments when the bill went to the Commons, and the bill now goes back to the House of Lords for the House of Lords to look at it again. We very much hope, well, we would like Parliament to reject this bill completely, but if it doesn't, we would like at least those protections back into the bill, because without it, I think it is a very, very dangerous precedent.
Well, I'm very tempted to say, welcome to our world, because we have had exactly the same legislation for many, many years. And I think from the time I was an undergraduate law student, I have fought this legislation. Personally, as a lawyer, as an activist, as a student activist, this is what I've done. And then I come all the way to Britain, and now I have to fight it here. So this is something, I think there's a thing, J.S. Mill, who is a well-known British thinker, writer, philosopher, all of that. And he said, India is a great experimental laboratory for the British Empire. And so, we have had a legislation called Taha, Terrorist Activities, Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, against which we fought. Parliament was forced to repeal it. They brought it back, and then we had another legislation. Again we fought it. Again it was dropped. Again now we have another one. And then so it goes on. The bottom line is this. We think that we are somehow this great civilized nation. What happens to those countries will not happen to us. And so we think that all that happens there. But when it happens there, as J.S. Mill realized, it can come here very quickly. And that is why I think these are some core values, regardless of where it is. We need to be watchful. And it's our watchfulness that is going to stop the erosion of these core values. And I think there was Frederick Douglass, who was a slave and a freed slave. And he said, our liberties are only as much as our willingness to defend them. So the day we stop defending them, that's where the line stops. So it's our watchfulness that makes sure how much liberties we have and how much we lose. And I think that's the debate to be had here.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of what James said, but particularly the initial point, which is the reason behind this, is that we need to be able to empower the security services to make sure they can carry out the relevant investigations and whatever. But I think we need to strip this back actually to what is the purpose of the judiciary. Well, in my eyes, I think it's keeping a check on the executive and the legislature. And if you look at where the secret courts will be held, I'd be interested to see the Supreme Court appointments which are made on recommendation from the Prime Minister to the Queen. So you already have a political agenda at play straight away at the Supreme Court level. The fact that a Secretary of State, who has a political agenda, of course, and is part of a wider political agenda, can then decide whether or not something, or petition the court on whether something should be held in the secret court, to me is extremely worrying. And I think it's a bit depressing that we're trying to reverse some of the core principles of justice, which is open courts, and what James said about laying everything on the table. It's a bit worrying, and I think it's quite scary that the government's trying to pursue this. And actually, when you look at the chamber and the turnout, it was a particular surprise that only 7 out of the 57 Liberal Democrat MPs voted against the secret courts bill, which to me was quite shocking, considering it wasn't really in the coalition agreement that was going to take place. What was in the coalition agreement was to reform the justice system and indeed how information is held. And I think this reverts back to this war on terror that we've been talking about for the past couple of decades. The Official Secrets Act, which I think was 2004, was already a step in the wrong direction. The fact that now we're trying to close down the judiciary to the public and indeed to the parties, to the court, is a big concern, and I think it's a step further in the wrong direction.
And I think just one more thing, that this is not only happening in Britain, it's already happened in New Zealand, it's happened in Canada, and what's going on in the United States, with basic things like habeas corpus and arrest of civilians and targeting civilians, the whole drone operation, there's something quite serious happening. And I think the sooner we become aware of this, the better for liberty.
Linked to this, of course, is the recent statement by Chris Grayling, the Justice Secretary, who said that the future Conservative government would scrap the Human Rights Act. There are also reports that Theresa May, the Home Secretary, wishes to go even further and remove Britain from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights altogether. So, given what these statements have entailed, following the recent reports, does the UK need the Human Rights Act at all?
I mean, I'm just astonished by this. I mean, I'm not radical or anything, but I grew up in Northern Ireland in the 70s, and the whole reason the Northern Ireland conflict, it started out as a civil rights movement for my parents lived in England for a long time. They were from the south. They went back to Northern Ireland. They weren't allowed to vote because of a particular discriminating law that denied people born the vote in the north. It was a petty piece of discrimination, but it was just so they paid their rates, but they couldn't vote. Enoch Powell ended up being our MP in South Down. My mother, God rest her soul, had long correspondence with Enoch about this. He wasn't interested, you may be surprised to hear. Now, my point about that personal anecdote is that injustice breeds upset and anger. And, you know, today, and then what happens is, a lot of the time, you get, the problem gets defined as a policing or a military problem to be dealt with that way. When actually what should happen is you should address injustice at the core and resolve it. And you should have proper standards for everybody. You should enshrine those standards in the law and you should apply them. Instead, what happened in Northern Ireland was, as was well documented by Peter Taylor, first of all they beat up people to get confessions. Then when that was revealed by Amnesty and others, they abandoned it. They introduced a supergrass strategy where informants identified 40 or 50 people. Of course, that collapsed when it was challenged in the courts. And the whole thing rumbled on for 25 years with countless dead, injured, jailed. And in the end, it came to a political solution. And I believe the experience of that within the UK was it degraded the human rights standards for everybody in the UK. One of the things about England is for 300 years there has been a slow accretion of civil liberty law here, which is one of the reasons why the country and the unofficial English constitution is admired around the world. And it is admired around the world. Because there's a belief about England and the legal system that it's fair, which, to use the rather maybe glib comparison, why the oligarchs come here to resolve their disputes. And it's a hard-won reputation, but it's got some value to it. Now, you could argue that maybe the English should have, or the British should have been, they should have applied the same standards equally around the world wherever they went, but let's park that for 1 minute. The problem with this secret court business seems to me is that what you're getting, the whole idea of a secret court says you're trying to hide something you don't want people to know about, because actually you know yourself it's not correct. So that's why you're doing it. So it just, what James is absolutely right. The whole conception is dangerous. And it's safe because basically what it does, it confers powers on people who you don't know to do things that you can't anticipate, for which there are no consequences for them. And I think it goes against the whole of what I understand is the very, if you go through the history of Britain, the development of a parliamentary democracy, the trade unions allowed to organise 2006 or 1906 to Disputes Act, women's suffrage, this whole development of the leaders of basic human rights in this country. And to start eroding it now over what possibly might happen, I just think it's just so dangerous. And I don't even believe it's going to be effective. I just don't believe it's going to be. And to go back to you guys, you lawyers in the room, I mean, this is why legal training should not just be about teaching the A to B of being a solicitor and a barrister. It's about building this philosophy that says the law is important. It's important that it's applied fairly and efficiently, and that it operates within a moral framework which respects human rights. And that what you've just told me, and this, I mean, just my last word, I know I'm a bit long-winded, but I mean this idea, right, that Britain, where the whole conception of maybe legal human rights started, wants to pull out of a convention on universal human rights. I mean, it's just a contradiction in terms. I mean, why can anybody say that this is a great political objective? I mean, it just seems to be astonishing.
I will touch on that, but Leo, you have one.
Yeah, I think the concern is with Theresa May and Chris Grayling, who maybe position themselves for a leadership battle, who knows. I think, especially in the ECHR stuff, that actually this is just bowing, I think, again down to popular support, which is that Britain has to withdraw some of its national sovereignty back from Europe. The popular support has been there for many years, partly because we've closed down discussion on things like immigration in this country, whatever. And I think the Eastleigh by-election, which I knew was a topic coming up tonight that we haven't touched on, I think we would be naive to not acknowledge that that UKIP came second with a 24.2% swing. And I don't think it was a protest vote because the Liberal Democrats won, so it doesn't seem like a protest vote. I think the issue over Europe is such of great popular concern to the public, partly because of their own ignorance, and whether the ignorance is through their own fault or not is another question. And I think we have to really be careful because the public appetite is there to go against Europe. We've seen it with the backing of a referendum in 2015. 49% of the people said they would pull out, and that's just going to get worse if things like the Abu Qatar case don't get resolved, where it's seen as that EU is a blockage to Britain's sovereignty over power, which I don't agree with, but this is what the press is spinning and actually what's coming back. Whenever I've done telephone canvassing in the past, that's always been a key issue that's come up, is immigration and Europe's power over Britain and Britain's lack of power over Europe. So I think that this is a big issue that isn't going away, but actually forms wider debate around Europe rather than just over human rights. I don't think people's individual concern on the street is whether their human rights are protected, but rather the impact that immigration, EU membership, the EU crisis, the EU sovereign debt crisis is having on their day-to-day lives. And the Conservative Party particularly are playing up on that and getting the dividends out of that. And that's partly because of the support that the press give them and give those populist issues. So there are some real concerns there, and I think we need to start having debate in the public sphere, which we haven't had previously. And hopefully we won't see that withdrawal when people come to sense and see that Europe's achieved a lot of things for them.
We at Liberty do polling occasionally when we get the money together, and we do things like we ask people, how important do you think it is that your privacy is protected? And unsurprisingly, 80 or 90% people say, oh, very important. How important do you think that your freedom of speech is protected? Similar sorts of figures. When you break down the rights protected by the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, people can see the point of having it. I think for us as lawyers, but I think more generally for society, that it is very important that we have a basic set of principles, benchmarks if you like, that we measure the law against. And this country is very unusual. Other countries across Europe, across the world, have written constitutions in which they will enshrine fundamental rights, give the courts the power to strike down legislation if it doesn't respect them. We didn't have that. Then part, that's because, as Sean says, we have this very long tradition of developing the common law and history of an unwritten constitution. But when it came to the end of the Second World War, we were faced with Europe devastated by Nazism and fascism in the 30s. What did we do? We set about trying to export the principles that underlined our common law, that were underneath it, to the rest of Europe. British civil servants were very heavily involved in drafting the European Convention on Human Rights, and when you look at it, it seems like exactly the sorts of principles that we should have in our law. The trouble is, we didn't have them in our law, and as time went by, through the second half of the last century, this country found itself increasingly before the European Court of Human Rights because we just didn't have those protections in our law. So I think it was an excellent idea of the Labour government that came to power in 1997 to bring those principles into our law, which is what it did in the Human Rights Act. We get a lot of advantages from that. Our courts are now considering issues under the European Convention on Human Rights. Our courts are now effectively persuading the Strasbourg Court, the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, the ultimate arbiter under the Convention, of how human rights should be applied in this country. I had great expectations of what we might achieve with the Human Rights Act before it came to force. I've been disappointed in places. The government, clearly, has lost cases as well and is disappointed as well. But our